They called it progress, but to me it felt like betrayal. I remember the first letter slipped into my mailbox, bold letters stamped across the top. Notice of sale. My land, my family's land, 3,200 acres of rich soil, grazing pasture, and woods that had carried our name for generations. Gone, sold off without my permission, carved up and parceled like it was some disposable commodity. The culprits. Not a bank, not the government, but the very same homeowners, association that had sworn their rules were meant to protect the community. My hands shook as I read it, because I knew what they had done wasn't just theft, it was war, and I wasn't about to lose the fight. I wasn't born into luxury. That farmland had been my inheritance, the only thing standing between me and poverty. My grandfather broke his back plowing those fields, my father poured sweat into every fence post and boundary line, and I had spent my youth working it under the scorching sun. It wasn't just property, it was legacy. But in one meeting, one backroom deal, the HOA signed papers claiming authority they never had, and suddenly everything we had built was gone. Developers moved in with bulldozers and blueprints, carving streets where cattle once grazed, driving steel stakes into ground that had once grown corn and wheat. And I was told there was nothing I could do. But they underestimated me. They thought I'd roll over, accept the scraps they offered, and walk away. What they didn't know was that I had studied every clause, every loophole, every dusty regulation that governed that HOA. I knew their names, where they lived, and, most importantly, what they didn't want anyone else to know. They thought they had buried me under the weight of legal paperwork, but they forgot one thing. I had the patience of a farmer, and I knew how to wait for the right season. And when it came, I would plant seeds of revenge so deep that they'd never recover. The nights after that letter came were restless. I'd sit at the kitchen table under the dim light, staring at maps and documents spread like a battlefield. The HOA members had built their homes on small parcels, smug in their gated comfort, believing the land around them was theirs forever. But hidden in the fine print of county records, buried under layers of filings they had overlooked, was a truth they never imagined. Much of the land beneath their own homes still fell under easements and claims tied to my original farmland. They had stolen from me, but in doing so, they had tied themselves to me more tightly than they ever realized. The first time I stood outside one of their homes, I didn't feel rage, I felt clarity. The porch light flickered, kids' bicycles leaned against the garage, and a smug sense of entitlement hung in the air like perfume. They thought they were untouchable. They thought I was powerless. But the law, if you know how to wield it, is sharper than any blade. I wasn't going to break a single window or raise a single fist. No, I was going to make the ground beneath their feet mine again. And I was going to do it by the book. When I walked into the courthouse to file my first motion, the clerk looked at me with surprise. "You really want to pursue this?" she asked. I smiled, not out of joy, but out of certainty. "I don't just want to pursue it," I told her. "I want to finish it." First crack in their armor came quicker than I expected. I remember walking out of the courthouse with copies of my filings tucked under my arm, the fall air sharp against my skin. To anyone else, I probably looked like a man drowning in paperwork. But to me, each page was a weapon, sharpened and ready. They had stolen 3,200 acres of my farmland, and now, piece by piece, I was going to take something far more valuable from them. Their homes, their comfort, their illusion of control. Most people don't realize that HOAs thrive on arrogance. They strut around with clipboards and bylaws, issuing fines over grass length and mailbox paint, pretending they hold the power of kings. But the truth is, they're just neighbors playing dress-up with authority. And when you study their rules long enough, you realize something. They're sloppy. They cut corners. They think nobody will notice. Well, I noticed, and I was going to use every single oversight against them. The first target was the president of the HOA, a man named Richard. He lived in a sprawling brick home on the edge of the subdivision, with a fountain in the front yard and manicured hedges trimmed into perfect squares. He was the type of man who believed rules applied to everyone but him. But what Richard didn't realize was that the very land his house stood on was tangled up in the same legal knot they had tied around my farmland. That fountain he admired so much. It wasn't even his to build. I had the deed to prove it. I still remember the look on his face the day the first notice arrived at his doorstep. Certified mail, official, unavoidable. He opened it on his porch, expecting it to be some routine document. Instead, his expression shifted from confidence to confusion, then to panic. Because in black and white it stated the undeniable truth. He no longer owned the ground beneath his own home. Legally, it had reverted back to me. His fortress had been built on stolen soil, and the law was finally on my side. Word spread fast. Within days, whispers rippled through the community. The HOA board tried to reassure everyone, claiming it was a clerical mistake, some trivial issue that would be fixed. But homeowners are paranoid creatures, and paranoia spreads like wildfire. They started to wonder, if it happened to Richard, could it happen to them too? And that was exactly the seed I wanted to plant. Fear, doubt, a crack in the foundation of their empire. But I wasn't satisfied with just fear. I wanted them to feel the same helplessness I had felt when I received that first letter. So I made sure the next strike was louder. I filed for legal possession of the property, which meant Richard wasn't just losing paperwork. He was losing the roof over his head. His neighbors watched as the sheriff's deputy tacked notices to his door, bright orange and impossible to ignore. For years, he had dictated the color of their shutters, the height of their fences, and the length of their grass. Now they saw him reduced to a desperate man, begging for mercy that would never come. And I stood there, silent, watching from a distance, as the mighty king of the HOA realized he was nothing more than a pawn. He had stolen acres of farmland without blinking an eye, but now he couldn't even protect the soil beneath his own feet. But this was just the beginning. Richard was only one piece of the puzzle. There were more board members, more enforcers, more arrogant voices that had voted to rob me of everything I owned. They believed their homes were untouchable, their lives secure. They believed wrong, because I had spent months preparing and every move I made was calculated. By the time they realized the storm that was coming, it would already be too late. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table again, papers scattered before me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not because justice had been served yet, but because the fight had shifted. No longer was I the man on the defensive, scrambling to protect what little I had left. Now I was the one pushing forward, the one drawing the lines on the battlefield. And the HOA, with all its rules and arrogance, was standing on borrowed land. My land. Silence of my home was broken only by the sound of a clock ticking on the wall. Each tick was steady, inevitable, like the steps of fate marching forward. I knew the board would meet soon. I knew they scrambled to find a way to undo what had been done. But the truth was written into every deed, every record, every overlooked clause. And no matter how many lawyers they hired, they couldn't change one simple fact. I wasn't just taking back what was mine. I was turning their entire world upside down. And Richard, he was just the first name crossed off my list. They thought removing Richard would stop me. That once the king fell, the village would rally to rebuild their walls. But they forgot one truth about people: fear lingers. It spreads into their homes, into their conversations, into their dreams. And while they whispered behind closed doors, wondering if they were next, I was already moving my pieces across the board. The next target wasn't as obvious as Richard. He was louder, yes, but not smarter. His name was Paul, the treasurer of the HOA. The man who loved to brag about how well the community's funds were being managed, even though most of it came from squeezing fines out of ordinary homeowners. He was smug, arrogant, the type to wear expensive suits even while mowing his lawn, always flaunting the illusion of wealth. What nobody realized was that Paul's fortune was built on borrowed sand. And I had the shovel to collapse it. Through county records and a few quiet trips to the registrar's office, I uncovered what Paul thought he had buried deep: liens, unpaid taxes, and most importantly, the same tangled easement agreements that had bound his land to mine. The HOA had been sloppy, and Paul had been reckless. He had built his little empire on a shaky foundation, and all I had to do was give it one good push. I'll never forget the morning his world began to crumble. A bright yellow notice slapped across his door, announcing foreclosure. Neighbors gathered in hushed groups, peeking from behind curtains, whispering about what could possibly bring down the treasurer who once acted like a banker to them all. His wife stood on the porch screaming into her phone, begging lawyers and banks to do something, anything. But the truth was simple. His house, like Richard's, no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me. The irony was delicious. Paul, the man who fined people for leaving garbage cans out too long, now stood knee-deep in his own trash, black bags piled on the curb after movers hauled his belongings out. He had been the face of the HOA's greed, pocketing fines and flaunting control, and now he was reduced to a shell of himself, powerless against the very rules he once enforced. But here's the part they never saw coming. I wasn't just after them as individuals. I was after the whole machine. Every member of that board had signed away my land like it was nothing, and every one of them would pay. Paul's fall wasn't just about revenge, it was about strategy. By removing their treasurer, I wasn't just cutting down a man, I was cutting off their lifeline. Without him, the HOA's finances were in chaos, and a fractured army doesn't win wars. Still, I knew better than to celebrate, because cornered animals are dangerous. And as the board scrambled to fill the hole Paul left behind, I could feel their panic hardening into something sharper, desperation. They would fight harder now, clawing at whatever scraps of authority they still had. But desperation makes people reckless, and reckless people make mistakes. One evening, as I drove past the subdivision, I saw it clearly. Porch lights flickering, blinds half closed, cars parked at odd hours. The sense of security that had once wrapped this community like a warm blanket was gone. Every shadow felt threatening, every knock on the door made them flinch. And as I watched, I realized something important. This wasn't just about homes anymore. This was about breaking their spirit. About making them understand what it meant to lose everything they thought was untouchable. But I couldn't stop there. Not yet. Because there were still more names on my list, people who had voted with smug grins, who had laughed at my protests, who had believed their little titles on the board made them gods. They had no idea that with every passing day, I was dismantling them one by one. That night, sitting alone with a glass of water at the kitchen table, I looked down at the list of names scrawled in front of me. Richard, crossed out. Paul, crossed out. Next came Linda, the secretary. Sweet, polite, always smiling, always pretending her hands were clean. But I knew better. She signed the papers, too. And her home sat on land tangled even deeper in legal webs than the others. She thought her silence would shield her, but in truth, it only made her an easier target. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, and I leaned back in my chair, the weight of silence pressing around me. This wasn't about rage anymore. This wasn't even about justice. This was about balance. They had tipped the scales against me, and now I was setting them straight, one house at a time. And as the night stretched on, I thought of my grandfather's words. "The land remembers," he used to say. "It holds every sweat, every sacrifice, every betrayal." He was right. The land did remember, and now so would they. They always say the quiet ones are harmless. That's what made Linda dangerous. She hid behind smiles, soft words, and a gentle demeanor that convinced her neighbors she was simply a helpful secretary. But I knew the truth. She was at every meeting, signing every motion, nodding along as the others carved up my family's land. She may not have spoken the loudest, but her pen was just as sharp as any blade, and her signature cut just as deep. I decided Linda would fall differently than the others. Richard had been about humiliation, Paul about collapse, but Linda needed exposure. She needed her neighbors to see that the one they trusted most was no different than the rest, a thief in polite clothing, and I had the documents to prove it. It started with a simple packet of papers, mailed not to her, but to every single household in the subdivision. Inside were copies of the HOA minutes, her signature neatly inked on the very page where my 3,200 acres were declared available for development. I didn't have to write accusations. The truth was enough. Neighbors who once smiled at her in passing now avoided her eyes. Whispers followed her from driveway to driveway. The illusion of innocence she had built crumbled overnight. But that wasn't the end. You see, Linda's home sat on a particularly precarious strip of land, one that had been misfiled in county records decades ago. The developers who bought my farmland had assumed it was theirs, but the truth was more complicated. In a twist of irony, her very property was one of the few that still technically belonged to me. She had signed away my inheritance, all while living on ground that was never truly hers. The paperwork was airtight. And once I filed it, the county had no choice but to acknowledge my claim. The day the notice appeared on her door, it wasn't the sheriff or a lawyer that broke her composure. It was the stairs. Neighbors stood in their yards, watching silently as she peeled the paper from the wood. Her hands trembled, her face pale. She tried to reassure them, claiming it was all a mistake, but no one believed her anymore. The woman who had once reminded them about bake sales and block parties was now just another thief exposed in daylight. I watched from a distance, the same way I always did, keeping my presence quiet but my impact loud. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, it was inevitability. They had all believed they were safe behind their rules and their titles, but in reality they had built their lives on sand, and I was the tide coming in. Linda tried to fight back. She called attorneys, begged city officials, even tried to rally the few neighbors who still offered her polite nods. But the law is cold, and once the paperwork was in motion, there was no stopping it. Her desperate calls went unanswered. Her money couldn't change what was written in deeds decades old. Within weeks, her family was packing boxes, her children's bicycles left abandoned in the yard. The subdivision that once praised her now watched in silence as she drove away for the last time, tears streaking her face. And yet, even as I crossed her name off my list, I felt no joy. This wasn't about joy anymore. This was about inevitability. Each member of that board had stolen something sacred, and each was losing everything they thought was permanent. Richard, Paul, Linda, 3 down, but the war was far from over. What struck me most was how the neighborhood began to change. It wasn't just the board members who lived in fear now, it was everyone. Every homeowner started questioning the very ground beneath their feet. Was their land safe? Were their deeds clean? Or were they next in line for one of my quiet, devastating strikes? The HOA had promised them protection. Instead, it had delivered betrayal, and I was simply the mirror reflecting their lies back at them. That night, as I sat once again at my kitchen table, the weight of silence heavy around me, I pulled out the list of names. Richard gone, Paul gone, Linda gone. Next came Mark, the vice president. Arrogant, smug, a man who thought his connections made him untouchable. But I knew better. His home wasn't just vulnerable, it was the keystone of their little kingdom. And once I pulled it out, everything else would collapse. The clock ticked toward midnight as I leaned back in my chair. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind again. The land remembers. Yes, it did. And with every home that fell, the land was speaking louder. And Mark, he had no idea the storm already had his name on it. Mark was different from the others. Richard had relied on authority, Paul on wealth, Linda on deception. But Mark, he thrived on arrogance. He was the vice president of the HOA, the man who strutted into meetings as if he owned not only the subdivision but the air his neighbors breathed. He wasn't just a board member. He was the self-appointed enforcer, the one who relished sending letters threatening fines, the one who stood tall at gatherings and reminded everyone how much order they owed to the HOA. If Richard had been the king, Mark was the sword, and he loved to swing it. But swords can break, and Mark was about to shatter. I began with silence. For weeks, I didn't strike directly. Instead, I let the fear of Richard, Paul, and Linda's downfall ripple through the community. Every conversation at the grocery store, every whispered phone call late at night ended with the same question, who's next? I made sure Mark knew it, too. A carefully placed envelope in his mailbox, unsigned, with nothing more than 3 crossed-out names. Richard, Paul, Linda, no threats, no explanations, just the truth. The message was clear, his turn was coming. And it ate at him. I watched from the shadows as his once boastful demeanor cracked. He paced in his yard at night, cigarette glowing between trembling fingers. His porch light stayed on until dawn, his blinds half open as if he expected someone to be watching. Which, of course, I was. Arrogance had built his reputation, but paranoia was tearing it down piece by piece. And once fear settled in, all I had to do was push. His home was unique in the subdivision. Larger, positioned at the center like a crown jewel. It was no accident. Mark had fought for it, demanded it, ensured he lived at the heart of the community he believed he controlled. But what he didn't realize was that his prized property carried the most fragile legal footing of them all. Old boundary surveys revealed encroachments, easements ignored, and filings never corrected. His fortress was built on cracks, and I had the hammer to split them wide open. The first official notice arrived one Tuesday morning. Certified mail, county seal. Mark ripped it open on his porch while neighbors watched discreetly from their windows. His booming voice, usually filled with confidence, trembled as he read. The land beneath his home was under dispute, legally tied back to the original acreage they had stolen from me. In plain words, his authority had no ground to stand on. Literally. But I wasn't finished. Days later, I filed for full reclamation of the property, not just the dirt beneath it, every brick, every wall, every square inch of the house he called his fortress. The law was slow, deliberate, but unstoppable. Deputies posted notices on his door, court dates loomed. And suddenly, the man who once dictated the height of his neighbors' fences was now fighting to keep his own roof overhead. The collapse was spectacular. At first, he tried to bluff. He stormed into meetings, shouting that it was all lies, that I was manipulating records. But his neighbors didn't believe him. They had seen too many falls already. And when his lawyer finally admitted the paperwork was ironclad, his bravado dissolved into panic. The day the sheriff arrived to enforce the order, the entire neighborhood came alive. Cars slowed, families gathered, whispers spread like wildfire. Mark stood on his porch, red-faced and screaming, his fists clenched as if shouting could undo the truth stamped in legal ink. But the deputies didn't flinch. They posted the final notice, giving him days to leave. His wife sobbed, his children clung to her legs, and the mighty vice president of the HOA, once feared, once obeyed, was reduced to a desperate man with no home to stand on. And I watched silently from my truck at the edge of the subdivision, not gloating, not smiling, just steady. This was never about pleasure. It was about justice, about balance. He had wielded authority like a weapon, and now he stood disarmed before the very people he once ruled. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table again, crossing his name off the list, I felt the shift. The board was fractured beyond repair. Their king gone, their treasurer bankrupt, their secretary exposed, and now their vice president stripped of everything. The machine that had stolen 3,200 acres from me was crumbling faster than I had even imagined. But there were still names left, and I knew the board wouldn't go quietly anymore. They would scramble, they would fight, they would throw everything they had into stopping me, which only made my next move inevitable. Because if Mark was the sword, then the next target was the shield, the board's attorney, the one who thought his words could bend the law to their will. He had drafted the papers that stole my land, and it was time he learned what it felt like to lose everything just as I had. The clock ticked past midnight, the list in front of me shorter than ever. Richard, Paul, Linda, Mark, 4 names crossed out, 4 homes reclaimed, 4 lives overturned. And the storm wasn't done. Every empire has a shield. For the HOA, that shield wasn't a wall of stone or an army of soldiers. It was a man in a tailored suit, armed not with weapons but with words. His name was Daniel, their attorney, the one who had drafted the documents that stripped me of my farmland. He was the one who told them with a smug grin and confident tone that their actions were airtight, that no judge would ever question the signatures, the stamps, the filings. To the board, Daniel wasn't just legal counsel. He was their safety net, their protector. As long as he stood with them, they believed themselves untouchable. But even shields can crack, and Daniel was about to discover that the law he had once wielded like a sword could just as easily turn against him. I started small. I tracked every case he had touched in the past decade, every land deal, every property dispute, every time his name appeared in the county courthouse. And what I found wasn't surprising. Arrogance makes men sloppy. Daniel had cut corners, manipulated filings, and even left trails of conflicts of interest he thought nobody would ever notice. Nobody, except someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to do but dig. The first motion I filed wasn't about land. It was about malpractice. I accused Daniel of knowingly drafting documents that violated county statutes, of misrepresenting deeds, of forging authority that never truly existed. To most attorneys, such accusations are nuisances, things brushed aside with technicalities. But I wasn't some amateur with baseless claims. I had proof. Copies, signatures, and witnesses who remembered what they were told at those fateful meetings. The news of the malpractice filing hit the HOA like a hammer to glass. Their shield suddenly looked less like steel and more like brittle wood. Neighbors whispered that maybe, just maybe, Daniel wasn't the savior he pretended to be. And when the Bar Association announced a formal review of his license, the whispers turned into certainty. Their protector was crumbling. But I didn't stop there, because Daniel didn't just defend the HOA, he lived among them. A 2-story home, tucked neatly into the subdivision he had once helped legally fortify against outsiders like me. His house sat on what had once been a field where my father grazed cattle. I knew it well because I had walked that ground as a boy. And I knew, buried in county archives, that part of his backyard still legally belonged to me through an easement never dissolved. A technicality, yes, but in the world of property law, technicalities are everything. So I filed another motion, this time not against his career but against his home. To Daniel, the first letter had been a nuisance, a professional headache. But the second, it was personal. It was the land beneath his children's swing set, the patio where he drank his morning coffee, the soil he believed was his. And suddenly, the shield that had once protected the HOA was defending himself instead, too busy scrambling to notice the arrows flying past. The day deputies came to mark his property was the day Daniel's mask fell completely. He stood on his porch, his suit wrinkled, tie loosened, shouting that it was impossible, that the filings were wrong, that this was an outrage. But the deputies didn't care. The papers bore the county seal, the judge's signature, and there was no argument left for him to make. His neighbors watched as his voice cracked, as his confidence dissolved into panic. The mighty attorney, reduced to a man begging for leniency he had never once offered to me. And as he stood there, I realized something. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about dismantling the very illusion of power. The HOA had built its empire on fear and false authority, but one by one I was tearing down the pillars they leaned on. Richard the king, Paul the banker, Linda the mask, Mark the sword, and now Daniel the shield. Without him they were naked, exposed, vulnerable. That night, as I crossed his name off my list, I sat in silence longer than usual. My kitchen felt colder, the ticking of the clock heavier. For the first time, I wondered if they were beginning to understand, not just that they had lost, but why. Because the land remembers. It remembers who nurtured it, who stole it, and who fought for it. And Daniel, with all his words and all his arrogance, had forgotten that truth. But I hadn't, and I wasn't finished. There were still names left on the list, and the deeper I went, the more I realized something else. This wasn't just about taking back what was mine. This was about making sure they never did it again. And the next name wasn't just another board member. It was the heart of their operation, the HOA president's wife, the quiet architect of their schemes, the woman who had pushed them into selling my land in the first place. As midnight crept closer, I folded the papers and slid them into a file marked simply with one word: next. The storm was far from over. Every army has its generals, every empire its rulers. Richard may have been the face of the HOA, but behind him there was always someone whispering, guiding, manipulating. That someone was his wife, Evelyn. To the community, she was the gracious hostess, the smiling woman who organized luncheons and neighborhood events, who baked pies for fundraisers and spoke kindly to newcomers. But I had seen through her mask. It was Richard who had dreamed of carving up my land for profit. It was Evelyn. And if Richard had been the king, she had been the queen, moving pieces across the board, always 3 steps ahead, always in the shadows. What they didn't know was that she had left fingerprints everywhere. The developers who bought my farmland hadn't first approached Richard. They had met with Evelyn. I found the emails, tucked into discovery records, her name at the bottom of contracts, her words urging them to move quickly before the farmer could stop them. The betrayal wasn't accidental. She had orchestrated the theft like a conductor leading an orchestra, each board member playing their role under her direction. And that made her dangerous, because while Richard fell to humiliation and paperwork, Evelyn had remained untouchable, her name never mentioned in meetings, her role always hidden behind the curtain. Until now. I knew that simply taking her home wouldn't be enough. Evelyn thrived on reputation, on the illusion of being beloved. So I decided to destroy her the same way she had destroyed me, through exposure. It began with a leak, a packet of documents mailed not to the HOA, not to her husband, but to the local press. Emails, contracts, signatures, undeniable proof that Evelyn had been the one pulling the strings. Within days, whispers turned into headlines. HOA Queenpin tied to land dispute. Her face, once smiling on neighborhood flyers, was now plastered across news articles. Reporters called her house. Cameras lingered at the subdivision gates, and her carefully curated image cracked under the weight of truth. Neighbors who once attended her gatherings now turned away in disgust. Mothers pulled their children from her lawn, whispers chased her through the grocery store aisles. She had built her life on control and respect, and I had stripped both from her in one move. But I wasn't done. Because while she fought the humiliation in public, I struck at her private world. Her house, the mansion she and Richard had proudly built on land they believed was theirs, was entangled in the same legal quagmire that had claimed the others. Easements, boundary errors, deeds connected to my family's acreage. I filed the motions quietly, patiently, letting the pressure mount. By the time the notice appeared on her door, she was already buckling under the weight of public shame. The notice was simply the final nail in her coffin. I was there the day she found it, though she never saw me. She opened the door in a robe, her hair undone, her face weary. In her hands, the bright paper shook as she read the words. Her home was no longer hers. For years, she had plotted to strip me of my land, and now the ground beneath her own feet had been reclaimed. I watched as she slumped against the doorframe, her power gone, her kingdom reduced to rubble. Her neighbors didn't rally for her. They didn't protest or defend her. They watched in silence, some with satisfaction, others with pity, but none with loyalty. Because loyalty cannot survive betrayal, and she had betrayed them all. That night I crossed her name off the list, but for the first time I paused. Evelyn's downfall wasn't like the others. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was the unmasking of the entire HOA. Without her, the illusion of authority collapsed completely. There was no king, no queen, no sword or shield left, only ruins. And yet one name still remained, the final piece of the puzzle, the one who had signed off on every single motion without hesitation, the one who claimed they were just following procedure. The HOA manager, Jonathan, the so-called professional hired to keep the gears turning, who had assured the board their theft was completely legal. He thought he was untouchable because he wasn't a neighbor, not part of the community. But he had been the architect of their paperwork, the hands that turned Evelyn's schemes into reality. And for him, I was saving the harshest justice of all. Because when the manager fell, it wouldn't just end the HOA, it would erase it completely. The clock ticked on, the list nearly empty. Richard, Paul, Linda, Mark, Daniel, Evelyn, all gone. Only Jonathan remained. And when his time came, there would be nothing left of the empire that stole my land but ashes and echoes. Jonathan thought he was safe because he didn't live among them. He wasn't a neighbor whose lawn you could point at, or a homeowner whose blinds you could watch twitch at night. He was the HOA's hired gun, the professional who came in with polished shoes, a leather briefcase, and the air of someone who believed the law bent to his command. He didn't attend their barbecues or stroll their sidewalks. He sat in offices, drew up contracts, and stamped his approval on the theft of my 3,200 acres. He was the man who turned Evelyn's whispers into binding documents, the one who promised the board, "It's all airtight. He can't touch you." But there's a flaw in believing yourself untouchable. When everyone else around you falls, you're suddenly the last one standing. And the last man standing is the easiest target. I started by pulling at the threads he had left behind. Jonathan had overseen dozens of HOA accounts across the county, juggling responsibilities, collecting fees, and filing paperwork. At first glance, he looked meticulous. But arrogance is a blinding disease, and Jonathan had caught it in full. He reused contracts, copied clauses without updating them, and in his rush to expand his empire, left loopholes so wide you could drive a tractor through them. Loopholes I was more than willing to exploit. The first move was financial. I filed suits against his management company, citing negligence, malpractice, and fraud. Cases piled up, one after another, each backed by documentation he had hoped nobody would ever examine. Homeowners from other neighborhoods, once silent, now reached out to me, sharing their own horror stories of misplaced funds and unauthorized decisions. The shield he thought his company provided was turning into a noose tightening around his neck. But the real blow came from the land. Jonathan might not have lived in the subdivision, but his company had purchased parcels as community property during development, the very same development built on my stolen farmland. And in a twist of fate too poetic to ignore, one of those parcels, a strip of land meant to be their prized community park, was still tied directly to my family's original deed. I filed the claim quietly, waited for the paperwork to move through the system, and when the county finally issued its ruling, the result was undeniable. The park was mine. The day the news broke, the subdivision collapsed. The last illusion of stability gone. Parents who once watched their children play there were told they no longer had the right to step on the grass. The HOA's last gift to the community had been built on stolen ground, and now it belonged to me again. The outrage wasn't directed at me, it was directed at Jonathan. He had promised them safety, legality, certainty, and now he was nothing but a fraud exposed in daylight. I watched as his company shuttered within weeks. Lawsuits drained his finances, his reputation bled dry, and contracts he once boasted about dissolved one after another. The board that had trusted him was gone, their homes reclaimed, their voices silenced. And Jonathan, he was left with nothing. Not land, not clients, not power, only the bitter taste of the promises he could never keep. And just like that, the HOA was no more. I sat at my kitchen table one final time, the list before me. Every name crossed out. Richard, Paul, Linda, Mark, Daniel, Evelyn, and now Jonathan. 7 names, 7 homes, 7 lives unraveled. Each strike had been deliberate, each move patient, like planting seeds in soil and waiting for the harvest. And now the harvest was complete. But as I stared at the list, silence heavy around me, I realized something important. This wasn't victory. It wasn't joy. It was balance. They had taken from me what was never theirs to take, and I had returned the weight of that theft tenfold. Justice doesn't always come with celebration. It comes with silence, with the steady knowledge that the scales have been leveled. I stepped outside that night, the moon casting silver light across the fields. My land. The wind carried the scent of soil, the same soil my grandfather once turned with his bare hands, the same ground my father walked at dawn. It had been stolen, abused, betrayed. But now it was mine again, and as I stood there I felt them with me, not just in memory but in presence. The land remembers, and tonight it remembered us. The subdivision behind me was dark, houses empty, streets quiet. Where arrogance and greed had once ruled, silence reigned. And I knew, as sure as the sun would rise, that no HOA, no board, no manager would ever dare touch this soil again. Because they had learned the lesson written in every acre. You can steal land on paper, but you cannot erase the blood, sweat, and history it carries. And when you try, the land will take it back, one way or another. I turned back toward my home, the list in my hand. One word scrawled across the bottom in thick ink, finished. And for the first time since that cursed letter arrived in my mailbox, I felt peace.